Good evening. This is David Traub, co-founder of Save Our Sites, welcoming you to another Zoom lecture that we present. This evening, we have author Joseph Minardi speaking about his newly published book, City of Neighborhoods, 1890 to 1910, Philadelphia. Joseph Minardi is an award-winning photographer and author of 3 books: Historic Architecture in West Philadelphia, Historic Architecture in Northwest Philadelphia, and Historic Architecture of the Neighborhoods of East Falls, Manayunk, and Roxborough. Joe is a member of the Germantown Historical Society, the Chestnut Hill Historical Society, and is on the board of the trustees of the University City Historical Society, and is the editor of their newsletter. This is his 4th book, which covers 20 years that transformed Philadelphia into a city of neighborhoods, from Kingsessing to Wissahickon.
Very good.
At the turn of the 20th century, Philadelphia was the workshop of the world, with builders toiling to fill the staggering demand of housing. This golden age of construction resulted in whole new neighborhoods for the city's burgeoning population. If you think there's a lot of new construction in Philadelphia today, which there is,
yeah.
Thank goodness, there was much more in that 20-year period around the turn of the 20th century. Imagine that. The book shows more than 20 vintage photographs.
200.
200?
Yeah.
Which whisk readers back to the neighborhoods as they once were, exactly as our great-grandparents knew them, but before modern influences altered them beyond recognition. Let me present now Joseph Minardi.
All right, thank you, David. Okay.
There we are.
Yep, there we are. Okay, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I hope you can all hear me pretty clearly. Okay. So tonight, like David said, we're going to be talking about my new book, City of Neighborhoods, Philadelphia, 1890 to 1910. As David said, this book contains over 200 vintage photographs, all taken from my collection of real photo postcards. And also there's some, a few glass plate negatives in there too, and some stereo views. But they're mostly of these postcard views that were issued in the early 20th century that show the neighborhoods as they originally appeared in the city of Philadelphia. So let's start. So Philadelphia had many nicknames over the years. It was known as the city of neighborhoods, the city of houses, the city of brotherly love, etc. But right here, we want to focus on the fact that it was known as the workshop of the world, which was actually a very fitting nickname because according to a U.S. manufacturing survey in 1910, of the 261 items listed in the survey, 211 of them were manufactured in the city of Philadelphia. And many of these were jobs that were filled by immigrants, people who did not have great education or even language skills, but it provided them with a job and enough money to either rent a house or even own their own house in time. So this manufacturing boom led to a boom in population, and also it was a great demand for houses to meet this new explosion in population. Okay, I guess I have to do this. The dominant style of residential architecture in Philadelphia is the row house, which has been around for about 300 years in the city. One of the earliest examples was Bud's Long Row, which was located along the Delaware riverfront. It was built in around 1691, but was demolished long ago. And also there's Elfreth's Alley, which is the oldest continually occupied city street in America that goes back to 1702. So during this period, as you can see, the city's population grew exponentially. It rose from about a little over 1 million in 1890 to about a little over 1.5 million, and 20 years later by 1910. So here's a map of Philadelphia. This was roughly the city map before the consolidation of 1854. As you can see, the city was composed of the city of Philadelphia, 9 districts, 6 boroughs, and 13 townships. Before it was the city and county of Philadelphia united in 1854. A lot of these boroughs and townships were in remote areas, and people identified it with those distinct small villages as their hometown rather than Philadelphia. But as you can see, after the Consolidation Act of 1854, the city and county of Philadelphia became one municipal entity. And these are the sections of the city that we're going to cover in the book. In this book, I didn't cover Center City, Philadelphia, because I felt that had been covered pretty extensively in previous books. And there wasn't enough focus on the outlying neighborhoods of Philadelphia. So that's the focus of this book is going to be the neighborhoods of Philadelphia and not so much Center City, Philadelphia. So the different types of residential architecture we're going to look at here are the twin house, which is found throughout all the sections of the city. Most commonly in West Philadelphia, you can find lots of twin houses, also called semi-detached houses. But more commonly throughout the city, you'll find the brick row houses, often 2 stories, but sometimes taller, as we'll see. You'll see some 3-story row houses. And even in Center City, there's some 4-story row houses as well. So in the middle photograph, you can see the basic type of row house. It's a 2-story brick fronted row house. Very plain, but very affordable for a worker. On the right-hand side, you see the more elaborate row house with the bay window and the front porch. Very nice. Okay. So like I said, a lot of the views are going to be taken from real photo postcards. The photograph on the left is a postcard from the 1898 to 1907 era. It was called the Undivided Back because you wrote your message right on the postcard right there, and you would write the address on the back of the card, and you write your message on the front of the card. So after March 1st, 1907, a new kind of postcard was invented called the divided back. So this way you can write your message on the back and the address on the back, and you can leave the front of the postcard with no marks on it. But people often mark the front anyway, as we'll see. So the first neighborhood we're going to look at is Lower North Philadelphia. It was a major manufacturing center. It was also an early example of a streetcar suburb. People took the trolley to get back and forth from their jobs in Center City to their houses in North Philadelphia. There was a lot of typical row house construction, but there was some nicer row house construction also. So the first photograph we're looking at here is the, let me get this out of the way. Why? Shit. So this is the 2800 block of Oxford Street and the Strawberry Mansion of Philadelphia in 1910. These houses were built September of 1894, and as you can see, these are three-story row houses, and these were considered quite nice for their day. This was a somewhat affluent section of the city at the time. These houses were built by a builder named John Stafford, as you'll see in the next photograph. He also built these houses, and at 29th and Jefferson, this is the intersection right here. This is in the Brewery Town section. These houses were built in May of 1895, also by John Stafford. As you can see on the corner, there's a pharmacy called Mengers Pharmacy. That was often the common arrangement back in those days. The corner property was reserved as a storefront on the ground floor, and above the storefront were residences, and that's often where the owner or the clerk working at the store lived in the floors right above the corner store. Okay, so the next photograph we're looking at is the 2200 block of Lehigh Avenue around 1908. This is in a section of the city that was once known as Swampoodle. These row houses were actually considered quite nice. As you can see, they're three-story row houses, bay window, front porch. People who lived in this neighborhood were lucky if they were baseball fans, because Shibe Park was built just one block away in 1909 at 21st and Lehigh. Also in this photograph, if you'll take a look at the left-hand side of the photograph, there's a small X above one of the houses. So the person who sent this postcard was indicating that is the house where he lived. And oftentimes, that's what people did with these postcards, is they would have a photograph made of their house and their entire block, and they would mail these postcards to their friends and family to show them where they had moved to. This photograph is the 1600 block of Eerie Avenue in North Philadelphia in 1908. These houses were built by a builder named Henry G. Schultz. These houses were built in June of 1906. As you can see, these are actually pretty nice row houses. Three-story bay window, very nice architecture, bit of a Mediterranean feel to it. Nice front lawns. Oops. Oops. The next photograph is 5th and Luzerne, around 1913. These houses were built in 1908 by a builder named John Schmunk. This section of the city is known as Franklinville. You notice there are businesses on the ground floor. These are the store dwelling combinations that I spoke about a little earlier. Back over to Strawberry Mansion. This is Haggard Street, east of 26th, 1908. These houses were built in July of 1904. So these houses were about 4 years old when this photograph was taken. As you can see, the trees in the photograph are still pretty young. They're probably, if the trees are still standing, they're probably very tall and overgrown by this point. Oops. So now we're going to go to Upper North Philadelphia, which is north of Roosevelt Boulevard, which was built around 1910. It was developed a little bit later, so the houses are more of a suburban style. They were built apart and not as dense. The housing arrangement wasn't not quite as dense as it was in the other sections of North Philadelphia. So this first photograph is 3rd Street below Olney Avenue in the Olney section of North Philadelphia in 1908. And as you can see in the photograph, 3rd Street was not yet paved. It's just a dirt road. And also you'll notice the houses are single and twin houses. Much more of a suburban setting than you would find in the rest of the city at the time. This photograph is Masher Street, south of Olney Avenue, 1910. These houses were built in the 1890s. And if you'll notice across Masher Street, you'll see the other side of the street is completely undeveloped at this time, and still just still woods at the time. The next photograph is Olney Avenue, west of 6th Street, 1910. You're looking at some twin houses. These houses were built in 1909 and 1910, so they were very new when this photograph was taken. These houses were built by Harry Schmidt in, like I said, 1909, 1910. This is the Olney section. Next photograph is Fairhill Street, north of Olney Avenue, 1909. As you can see, Fairhill Street was in a fairly muddy and deeply rutted condition at the time. These houses were built between 1896 and 1908. This photograph is 72nd Street, west of Old York Road in 1909. As you can see in this photograph, it kind of has like a little bit of a village feel to it. At the end of the block is Broad Street, and this is at the extreme north end of North Philadelphia. And if you notice on the right, there's a corner store selling various canned goods. The next photograph is Beechwood Street, north of Chew Avenue, 1910. These houses were built in August of 1909 by a builder named Robert Callot. And if you notice, Chew Avenue in the foreground is completely unpaved and in a pretty rough state at the time. Okay. Next, we're going to look at Northeast Philadelphia. Major center of activity was Frankford, and the far Northeast was very rural at the time. So let's take a look at that. Okay, the first photograph is the 8,000 block of Frankford Avenue in the Holmesburg section of the city. If you notice on the left, there's a collection of late 19th century eclectic buildings of various architectural styles. Lots of businesses on the ground floor. There's a barber shop, there's a grocery store, a boot store. And if you notice, you can see a man on the telephone pole doing some repair work, risking his life for the telephone company without a net. Next photograph is the Bustleton section. This is Bustleton Avenue at Welsh Road, 1910. This section of Bustleton was actually a carriage manufacturing center. A lot of carriage manufacturers were located in this section at the time. In this photograph, you can see F.C. Ashton's carriage and wagon building shop. And on the far right is DeKalb's, it used to be called DeKalb's Pharmacy, but at the time of this photograph in 1910, they were selling gasoline and cylinder oil for your automobile. So the next photograph is Bustleton Avenue, north of Grant Avenue, 1910. And as with the previous photos, this definitely has like a small village feel to it. You can see some eclectic mix of late 19th century residences in the photograph. In the distance, you can see the Bustleton Methodist Episcopal Church, which was built in 1868. In the next photograph, we're looking at Frankford Avenue, north of Unity Street, 1910. The one major difference between this photograph and the view nowadays is the Frankfurt L has not been built yet in this photograph. So if you look at this photo now, you would see the underside of the Frankfurt L. Now we're looking at Rowan Street, west of Dittman, 1907. This photograph is in the Holmesburg section of the city. And again, this is a collection of late 19th century residences many of which are still standing, which is good news. But unfortunately, many of the houses in this photograph, even though they're still standing, they've been somewhat altered from their original appearance. So this is a good opportunity to see what they originally looked like. This is true of many of the houses in this book. So this is Thompson Street east of Lefevre in the Bustleton section of the city. There's a quiet little street view in Bustleton. The church in the background was All Saints Catholic Church, built in 1895. The church is still standing, but unfortunately, the top part of the tall steeple has been removed, which is often the case with a lot of these tall steeples. I'm sure someone's going to ask me about that. Next, we're going to go over to the Kensington section, which is a major manufacturing center and also features a lot of dense row house architecture residences that Philadelphia is pretty famous for. So this, the first photograph in Kensington is Hartville Street, south of Allegheny Avenue, 1910. This is a pretty typical brick row house architecture in Philadelphia. These houses have the interesting arched window heads and doorways, which is something you don't often see in Philadelphia. So it makes these houses a little bit unique, but these houses were small and affordable for factory workers. So the next photograph is 8th Street north of Westmoreland. This is the photograph on the cover of the book. These houses were built between 1906 and 1909. The houses on the left were built in 1906 and the houses on the right were built in 1909. And if you look at the houses on the right, they're of the very plain worker style row house. Not much, nothing terribly fancy about them. Just two-story brick row houses. This also looks like it was a good neighborhood to raise a family, judging by all the children in the photograph. And if you notice on the left-hand side of the photograph, there's a saloon with a saloon keeper standing out front. Saloon is complete with the swinging doors. You'll see quite a few saloons in Kensington and other sections of Philadelphia. Next photograph is Jasper Street, north of Venango, 1908. As you can see on the right-hand side of the photograph, that block has completely been filled up with houses, but at the time it was just an empty lot, overgrown with grass and weeds and trees, and children posing in the foreground, right in the middle of the street, with no cars. So it must have been nice to be able to play in the street without any worrying about any cars. There were probably other hazards, but no cars. Next is Kensington Avenue, south of E Street in Kensington, with the also with Frankfurt Avenue. This view of Kensington Avenue would have the the Frankfurt L running right down the middle of the street. So this view would be very different today. But as you can see in the photograph, it was a very busy section of the city at the time. Lots of commerce, lots of dense row houses. The next photograph is Madison Street, east of Emerald in Kensington, 1908. As you can see, typical row house style architecture. A lone wagon in the middle of the block and three well-dressed men standing on the right-hand side, standing outside of Cliggett's Tavern. Next photograph is Rochelle Street, north of Cambria, around 1911. This block is, again, very typical of what you would find in Kensington at the time and other parts of the city. The houses on the left and right were built in 1890 and 1901, or excuse me, 1891. In the distance, you can see on the right-hand side, you can see the a big mill that was the Carruth Endurance Mill, and it's probably a safe bet that a lot of the workers in that factory lived in these houses on this block. It was a pretty good arrangement for workers to live close to their place of employment, being as that they worked long hours. They didn't want to have to take several trolleys to get back and forth to their job. On the right, as you can see, is another typical tavern in Kensington. This one sold Yinglings. Okay, so next we're going to go over to South Philadelphia. This is one of the poorer sections of the city at the time. There was a lot of cemeteries and hospitals and things that other industries that the city wanted to keep away from the general population. As the city's population grew, the city's grid pattern pushed ever further south, replacing farmland and cemeteries with the typical row houses that you would find throughout Philadelphia. Also, the Navy Yard was located at the very bottom of South Philadelphia. And this was also a vibrant immigrant section of the city. Many Jews, Italians, and Irish had migrated to different parts of South Philadelphia in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So the first photograph we're looking at, this is a pretty rare view of South Philadelphia. This is a view of South Philly when it was still farmland. This is the current view of 8th and Rittner Street around 1902. As you can see in the photograph, there's a farmer tilling his field. There's another well-dressed man on the far right, if you could see it, wearing a suit and a bowler hat. That man is probably Charles Schätzlein. He's responsible for developing hundreds of houses in South Philadelphia, including the houses built on this area. So this was probably an advertising photograph used by Mr. Schätzlein to advertise where he was going to build some new houses. But farmland was not uncommon in South Philadelphia in the early 1900s. Now we're looking at 2nd Street north of McKean, 1902. These houses were built in 1890. Even though these are typical brick row houses, they do have the added attraction of a nice front porch, which in the days before automobiles, having a front porch must have been a nice little feature, especially if you had lots of children. You could sit out and enjoy the evening and watch your kids play in the street. Front porches are not very common in South Philadelphia, but so these are actually pretty nice. This photograph is 12th and Porter, 1907. These houses were built in 1906. These are the typical row house type architecture. Nothing too fancy about them, just typical row houses. And excuse me, the business on the corner sold sporting goods and cigars. A pretty odd combination. So the next photograph is Dickinson Street east of 15th. This is looking eastward towards Broad Street. These are late 19th century 3-story brick row houses with marble steps. These are all still standing. And in the distance, you can see the Blessed Virgin Mary Catholic Church, which was built in 1863, which is still standing, minus the top part of its steeple. So over we go to Fitzgerald Street east of 21st. This is in what's now called the Graduate Hospital neighborhood in South Philadelphia. This was probably considered a somewhat affluent section of the city at the time. The children are all very well dressed, probably had just gotten out of school. Some of these kids even have roller skates, which was pretty nice for its day. This is 20th Street north of Porter Street. This is 1 block north of the Gerard State Historic District. These houses were built in August of 1909 by a builder named Burton C. Simon, who was responsible for building hundreds of houses in this immediate neighborhood. This row of houses is still standing, but many of these front porches have been enclosed, so you don't have these lovely open front porches anymore. Also, unfortunately, many of these bay windows have been covered with aluminum siding or have been altered in other ways. So what you're looking at is the row of houses as the builder and the architect originally envisioned them. The next photograph is, this is the part of the Gerard State Historic District in South Philadelphia, which is an actual historic district. And as you can see, these are twin houses. The houses in Gerard State were built between 1906 and 1916. And they were built mostly as twins. Just about all of them are twins. Twins are very uncommon in South Philadelphia. But here you can see these houses were built in 1908. The man who lived in this house marked his house with the X, as you can see right above it. Gerard State stretches from 17th Street all the way over to around about 23rd Street, and is south from just about Manayunk Avenue down to Shunk Street in South Philadelphia. So that's the Gerard State Historic District, at least part of it. Okay, so now we're going to go over to Southwest Philadelphia. Business corridors located along Baltimore Avenue and Woodland Avenue. Lots of suburban twin-style houses in the late 19th century. And in the early 20th century, more typical row houses. So the first photograph we're looking at here is Woodland Avenue along east of 63rd Street in 1908. These houses were built in April of 1896. And if you look closely at the corner property on the left, or excuse me, on the right-hand side of the photograph, it was the pool room of E.M. Smith on the ground floor. And that's probably Mr. Smith standing with his family right outside the front door. Woodland Avenue was a major trolley route, as was Baltimore Avenue in Southwest Philadelphia. There were quite a few trolley routes in Southwest and West Philadelphia. Just like this one. This is Baltimore Avenue, east of 58th Street. Here we're looking at some colonial revival style houses. This photograph is 48th and Springfield. That's this intersection right here. On the right-hand side, you can see some late Victorian twin houses built in around 1895 or 1896. On the left-hand side of the photo is a single house. It's known as the Castle that was built in 1903, so a little bit later than the rest of the houses on the block. This house was designed by an architect, Charles Boulderston, and it's known as the Castle in the neighborhood. And there are a few other castle-like structures in the neighborhood, but this house is particularly beautiful and interesting, I think. This is Pascal Avenue west of 64th Street, 1907. These are twin houses built in 1899, designed by an architect named E.A. Wilson. E.A. Wilson designed hundreds, if not thousands, of houses in West and Southwest Philadelphia. A little bit later, he became a real estate developer, guessing probably there was more money in the real estate developer than it was being an architect. As you can see, these houses are late Victorian, maybe somewhat of a Mediterranean influence with them. Very nice open front porches. Unfortunately, as with many of the front porches, they've been enclosed over the years. But at the time they were very nice suburban style row twins. Next photograph is Kensington Avenue looking east from 84th Street. These are also twin houses. These houses were built in 1891 and 1892. They're all still standing except for the second house from the right, which was demolished long ago and replaced by a totally modern house that does not fit the rest of the block at all. It's a totally different and totally mismatched. But here we're getting a chance to look at the block as it was originally intended to look by the builder and the architect. This photograph is Paxton Street north of Greenway Avenue in 1911. These houses were built in March 1905. The builder was Charles Henderson. Even though this is a somewhat narrow block, these houses were considered pretty nice for their day. Bay windows, front porches, pretty nice things to have in the days before air conditioning. So now we're going to look at West Philadelphia. West Philadelphia was known as a streetcar, parts of West Philadelphia were known as a streetcar suburb. The Market Street elevated subway opened March of 1907, helped extend residential architecture and building further west. Also led to early 20th century denser row houses, and also apartment buildings became very popular in the early 20th century also. So let's take a look at West Philadelphia. Here we're looking at twin houses on Cedar Avenue east of 47th Street around 1907. This photograph, these houses were built in the early 1900s, around 1901. These were actually considered very nice twin houses. 3.5 stories, as you can see, complete with dormers, front porch, bay windows, and nice front lawns. The people who lived in these houses were probably considered somewhat affluent and were often able to afford live-in help also. The live-in help probably lived in the top floor of these houses. Here we're looking at some Queen Anne style late 19th century twin houses on Walnut Street east of 43rd around 1910. Unfortunately, these houses were demolished. This is 61st Street south of Chestnut Street, 1908. These houses were built in 1905 by James Clark. This style of architecture is also found in other parts of West Philadelphia. As you can see, these has stone front porches and these stone retaining walls with the inverted arch. And we're going to see this style of architecture in the next photograph as well. This is 61st Street north of Arch Street in 1908. These houses were built a year later in 1906. So they were about 2 years old when this photograph was taken. But as you can see, this style of architecture is almost identical as seen in the previous photograph. Over we go to the Belmont section of West Philadelphia. This is Brooklyn Street north of Ogden, 1908. These houses were built in September of 1890. And as you can see, these have very nice brickwork in the upper levels, and some very nice woodwork on the front porches and the porch supports. So over we go to the Mantua section of West Philadelphia. This is Brandywine Street west of 33rd, 1908. These houses were built between 1893 and 1897. So these are good examples of late Victorian row house architecture. So now we're going to take a look at Northwest Philadelphia, important manufacturing center in Manayunk. Also, it was a early example of a railroad suburb in Germantown and Mount Airy. Workers would take the commuter railroad lines to their houses in Germantown and Mount Airy to their jobs in Center City. Late 19th century suburbs in Chestnut Hill, and also suburban style houses in the Wissahickon section. Okay. So the first photograph we're looking at is Rochelle Avenue east of Reeve Street, 1910. These are very nice row houses, 3 stories tall, as you can see, with a bay window on the second floor and a front porch, front lawns. And as you can see, the sender of this postcard marked his house with that little arrow you can see on the right-hand side, just above the house. Next photograph is Rochelle Avenue west of Freeland Avenue, 1910. Here you can see some late Victorian architecture. These are twin houses built around 1890. Once again, this is in Wissahickon. If you look carefully on the left, you can see a telephone worker on the pole risking his life for the telephone company. Next photograph is Osborne Street, west of Maniac Avenue, 1906. These houses were built in April of 1890. Over to Manayunk. This is Maniac Avenue, north of Osborne Avenue, 1906. These houses were built in 1899. Over to Germantown. This is Lena Street, east of Chilton, 1910. This is an interesting example of how architectural tastes have changed during this period. The houses on the left were built in 1896 and were done in a more typical Victorian style of architecture, while the houses on the far right were built a decade later in 1906, and you can see they were in a more practical bay and porch style. With the bay window and the front porches. The next photograph, this is in the East Falls section of the city. At the time, this was known as the Falls of the Schuylkill. This is Ainsley Street, looking north from Crescent, 1907. And as you can see in this photograph, it's kind of like a little bit of a hodgepodge of late 19th century residential architecture. Yet somehow, even though these are different styles, they tend to look nice together. Okay. Before we wrap up, we're going to look at the people who lived in these houses. Philadelphia, as I mentioned earlier, was a rapidly growing city at the time. It was also an ethnic enclave. Many people came to Philadelphia looking for a better life. Also had one of the established African-American communities in the United States at the time, third largest urban Black population in America in those days, and also suburban community in the outlying areas of the city. So the first photograph we're looking at is a group photograph of the employees at the Historical Printing Company, circa 1895. This printing company was located around 40th and Market. Next photograph is the Kelly family posing around 1890 in front of their steam pump and beer pump distributor store. Next photograph is a bunch of children posing on top of a delivery wagon. This wagon belonged to the H.A. May Company, which was located at the 30th and Chestnut at the time. This photograph is from around 1900. And the last photograph we're going to be looking at is John W. Rhone standing in front of his delivery truck around 1907. And this photograph is taken in front of his house in South Philadelphia at 2015 Pierce Street in the Point Breeze section of West Philadelphia, excuse me, in South Philadelphia. And according to city directories, Mr. Rhone was known as a driver and a laborer. And apparently he was doing well enough at the time to afford his own delivery truck. So pretty interesting photo there. Okay. So thank you for attending tonight's presentation. And remember, just because something has been around for a long time doesn't mean it will be there forever. Okay. Yep, that's it.
Well, Joe.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a fascinating lecture and your incredible photographs and your collection. Don't you wish we could all kind of walk back into that world, at least for a couple weekend afternoons?
Yeah, David, I think you would want to visit, but I'm not sure that you want to live there permanently.
Well, who knows? Anyway, let me introduce David Sofa, who's on the staff of Save Our Sites. He's helped us put together this great presentation. David, I think you want to ask if there are any questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, David. So at this time, if you have a question, I'm going to go ahead and ask everyone to unmute themselves. So if you do have a question, please just go ahead and raise your hand using that function, and then you can ask your question. And then otherwise, you can also feel free to put it in the chat, and I can read it that way.
Is there anything in the chat right now?
It doesn't look like it at this time, but.
I see a hand raised. You have to unmute. You have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, hi everybody. That's a fun, lovely talk.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I was very interested in the variety of developers and how we know who did what and what. I'd be curious to know about their reputations at the time, and if certain were these architects generally developers, or who were the developers?
That's an interesting question. I'm getting a little feedback, David.
Better?
Can I hear it? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I actually had to do a lot. I did all my research myself. A lot of it was done in the city directories. I had to go through them individually, and it took about 2 years to go through them all. There were thousands and thousands of houses being built in Philadelphia at the time. So I put together this large database, which I'll be happy to share with anybody if they want to see it. But a lot of these developers were largely unknown to people nowadays. We don't know. We know about some of the architects, but we don't know about a lot of the developers. And also a lot of architects, as I mentioned I mentioned the name E.A. Wilson. He and a couple other architects like Robert Pitts, they branched out into developing, probably realizing that there was more money to be made in real estate development than there was in the architecture business. But I think a lot of these houses were also not architect designed, but they were designed by, they were probably pattern books that were circulating at the time among various developers.
We have some questions coming in through the chat.
Yeah,
So
okay.
someone wanted to know whether there are images, whether in your collection you had any images of interiors.
I do have some, not photographs, but I have a diagram of a typical late 19th century interior. but the book mostly photographs on the exteriors of the houses.
Great.
Yeah.
We also have a Stephen. Do you want to share your question?
Yes, I was going to type it. Maybe this is a question similar to the previous one about developers and architects and sources. And I'm wondering how you were so well able to determine when a particular row or area of developers' houses were built, that is, the particular years.
Right. So when I was researching for the book, I actually had to go to the city archives, and they have on file the building permits that were issued by the builders that had to be submitted to the city of Philadelphia. And on the permits, it will tell you some precise information, not only when they were built, but how many houses were built, the approximate cost, building materials. So actually these building permits are really great sources for information about not only how many houses were built, but who the builders were, who the architects were, if any, and just location. They're actually very great treasure troves of information. Unfortunately, they haven't been put online yet, so I had to actually do all the research myself in person. But it took quite a while, but yeah, I actually got through it all. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, they are a great source. Of course, they're not accessible right now, either
Yeah.
online or in person, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was actually lucky to get to them before the pandemic.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Okay, we have another question through the chat. Are corner stores as prominent in other cities, to your knowledge?
Good question. I'm not 100% sure, but I like to visit other cities, of course. One of my favorite places to visit is Brooklyn, and there are corner stores everywhere in Brooklyn. So I assume that was a pretty much common practice in the 19th century. You have to imagine that in those days, you didn't have the big box stores or even big grocery stores to go to. So you had to have everything conveniently located within a block or two of your house. Otherwise, it would take you all day just to go shopping, and you wouldn't have time to do much of anything else. So my guess is it was pretty much a common practice throughout the United States.
Great, great. We have another question. Did you consider having a couple of now pictures from the same perspective, perhaps sepia toned?
Well, that sounds like a good idea for maybe a future project. Every once in a while, I'll do like a hybrid photograph in Photoshop where I'll take the now view and the before view, and I'll kind of like meld them together.
Okay, how about, did the builders have anything to say about how wide the sidewalks could be?
That's a good question. I'm sure that they actually knew how far back they were going to set their houses from the street. So I'm sure they had a lot of input into that. Yeah. I think things were a little less regulated in those days. So I think that's pretty safe to say.
Yeah, and another question coming in. How was the construction of these homes compared to their modern equivalents? Were they much more robust, or how affordable were they to the average worker?
I would say a row house properly maintained can last for hundreds of years. I would definitely not say that about any house that was built nowadays. As a matter of fact, I think if you get just a few years out of them, you're probably ahead of the game somewhat. I think some of these houses built nowadays are built just to last until the 10-year housing abatement has worn off, expired, I should say. These houses were affordable, of course. Builders wanted people to buy their houses, and they were built in a number of different price ranges. you could see some of these houses were just very plain two-story brick row houses. And they were either sold or rented to factory workers or workers in the mills. Some of the more elaborate three-story houses or twin houses were marketed or sold or rented to the up-and-coming white collar or manager class in the city of Philadelphia. So you had two different rising stratas of income levels in the city.
Great. So we have time for just a few more questions. Kind of following on that last, talking about the cost of homes. Do you have any idea of the range of the cost?
Sure. Actually, in the building permit, the builder would put the estimated cost of what it costs to build the house. So you could see the prices to build the house were in the range of maybe a little over $1,000. Some were actually a little under. Some were $900 a piece to build, which may not sound like a lot of money, but about 120 years ago, $100 was maybe a month's pay or something like that. But
A steal.
so you can look at the price that the builder paid for the house, and you can just extrapolate how much more he would charge to sell or rent the house to recoup his money.
Okay, so we'll do, there's two more questions in the chat, and then Steven, looks like you have another question. Let's do the chat. So do you have a favorite photo of housing or architecture?
Oh, sure. So I'll bring up this photograph if you could see it. I think I have a degree in art, so I kind of like photographs that have a little bit of an artistic touch. So this photograph, I just like the composition of it.
Oh, go ahead and your screen is not sharing anymore if you want.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
All good.
So anyway, it's a photograph of Ainsley Street. Some of you may recall that. I don't know if I could share again, but David, am I allowed to share my screen again? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, this photograph I liked a lot, just from the composition of it. I also liked this photograph in Germantown. Again, I think that the composition is very nice, and I like the way that it just kind of leads your eye into the background. So I feel that's very nice. And also the photograph that was used for the cover, that's also a very nice photograph, just showing what the neighborhood was like back in the olden days. So those would be my three favorite, David.
Great, thank you. And then one more question in the chat. Where was the African-American area you were describing?
For the most part, it was located in South Philadelphia, below South Street and below. Actually, no, I take that back. It was located South Street and just above, west of around 6th or 7th Street, extending westward. It was a pretty small, close-knit neighborhood. And there was also some ethnic enclaves to the east and to the south of that as well. So that was a kind of an interesting ethnic mix back in those days.
Okay, great. So why don't we close? Stephen, did you have another question?
Yes, I did have one more. Just wanted to mention, I live in East Falls and know that block of Ainsley.
Right.
And those Second Empire stone twins are still there, kind of descending down the hill. It's very impressive.
Right.
Well, I was curious if you know, there must have been a huge demand for bricks. And I wonder if you know where in the city, where the various brickworks to supply all those brick row houses around the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's a good question. The one photograph I showed earlier in the presentation of Haggard Street, that was actually built on top of an old brickyard. So it's kind of interesting to think that row houses actually replaced a brickyard because bricks were in such great demand. But yeah, there were obviously many brick manufacturings in various parts of the city. I'm not quite sure where they were located. Probably, if I had to guess, North Philadelphia was probably a good section for brick manufacturing. Possibly also South Philadelphia, I would think. But yeah, it's a good question.
Well, again, thank you. Wonderful photographs.
You're welcome. Yes.
Okay, so that's just about all the time we have for questions. David, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, well, David Sofa, thank you very much. And Joe, thank you very, very, very much again. Let me ask Joe a very important question as how and where might you purchase this new book that's just been published? Can you speak to that a little bit? And then I have a comment and we'll begin to close off the program. But Joe, we want you to get your books out there so the public can see more of these photographs.
Well, you can buy this book anywhere that books are sold.
Well, I do know that if you walk into the Barnes and Noble store on Rittenhouse Square, you can see the books.
They should have some copies. I hope so.
They do, right? You go right in the door, and right on the right, there's a pile of your books. So right.
Oh, pile. Okay, good.
So I just want to make one comment in the line of our preservation efforts, and that's that in your photographs, particularly the row house streets, you see the look of a city that's largely disappeared, and that's the uniformity of the rows, the humidity, the consistent materials and construction, the look. It just this weekend, Inga Saffron wrote in her column about Christian Street and Fitzwater Street, which is in your book, a photograph of Fitzwater. That the blocks are being chopped up with new construction. Old and fine houses are being demolished for larger 4-story houses, and so that unfortunately the look of the city is lost. A certain urban aesthetic that I personally feel is beautiful, and what's replacing it is what I call a ugly motley mix to a great extent. Save Our Sites, of course, is concerned with preserving the look of our city within reason to the extent possible. Okay, so that closes off our talk, and I just have a few announcements about the future. On April 20th, we're going to have another Zoom lecture. Dr. Michael J. Lewis of Williams College, and also he's the architectural writer for the Wall Street Journal, will give a talk about his new book, which I understand is a compendium of his various articles over the years. And then in June, we're hoping to have our annual tour outside and inside. If pandemic pending, we want to visit the newly renovated Mario Lanza Museum in South Philadelphia. That should be very, very interesting. Last year, before last, we went to the Marian Anderson House in South Philadelphia. So this year we want to go to the house of another great Philadelphia singer, Mario Lanza. And then we'll end that afternoon with a visit to Mario Lanza Park in the Queen Village section of the city near 2nd and Catherine. So we hope all of you can attend those events. And we thank you very, very much for coming tonight. And we're very grateful to everyone in the audience who attended. Good night to you all.
Night.
Good night.
Night.